In this section, I will try to briefly cover the 3 waves of feminism. Some even argue we're currently in the middle of a 4th wave, and highlight the major achievements of each wave. We will also assess how certain aspects of exclusion, radicalism, and extremism within the movement have contributed to some of those negative stereotypes we see surrounding feminism. First wave feminism essentially occurred simultaneously with the Industrial Revolution, about the late 19th century, in which women demanded equal economic, legal, social, and political opportunities. Now, when we talk about the women's movement of the late 1800s, oftentimes people just refer to this era as the women's suffrage movement, or the right to vote. But this movement was not just about the right to vote. In fact, it was about women's rights to a good education, the right to own property, the right to earn wages, the right for married women to be recognized as legal entities, or the right to hold leadership positions in the church, just so much more than just voting. Let me provide a little bit of legal history on the issue for all of my pre-law majors to give you an idea of how the states and courts viewed women from about 1700 to 1900, so about 200 years. So back in the mid-1700s, if you wanted to become a lawyer, you read Sir William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. It was the premier interpretation on contemporary law. And boy, let me tell you, his interpretation of the legal status of married women was archaic, to say the least. In Commentaries, Blackstone describes a legal doctrine known as coverture, which basically meant by marriage, the husband and the wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband. And I mean, that is just wild to think about today. Marrying someone and essentially having your legal identity erased. And this interpretation of the status of married women had significant ramifications. It essentially created a reality in which women did not legally exist. They could not enter into legal contracts or acquire property. If they were permitted by their husbands to work, the husband received all of her wages. They could not bring issues to court because they did not have legal personhood, and even bodily autonomy was denied to women. Concepts of domestic violence or marital rape could not exist because women did not legally exist. So you might be thinking to yourself, my God, just don't get married then. Stay single and retain your legal autonomy. But back then, being an unmarried woman, or a spinster, as they were called, was completely socially unacceptable. And not to mention that many of these distinctions were practically meaningless to most American women, considering that slavery remained legal at the time. So when we fast forward to the late 1800s, women aren't just fighting for the right to vote, they're fighting for their very legal existence. So in 1848, first wave feminism officially begins with the Seneca Falls Convention, and based upon everything we just discussed, these women had a lot of things they wanted to accomplish. So from about 1850 to the early 1900s, these women were on the front lines trying to abolish slavery, advance the legal status of women, acquire economic and social power, and finally, by 1919, rejoicing in the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, which granted women the right to vote. But perhaps, as you can gather from this photo here of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, the movement had a pretty bad reputation for being exclusionary, not only in terms of women of lower economic class, but, well, race as well, as we can see from this photo. For instance, in 1918, NASA tried to persuade Southern states to ratify the 19th Amendment by appealing to fears of what would happen if the black vote were to ever surpass the white vote. NASA explicitly advocated that if the continuance of white supremacy in the South were to prevail, they must grant the vote to white women. Second wave feminism begins to crest in the 1960s and continued well into the 1990s. Unlike the first wave of feminism that was primarily dominated by upper-class, cisgender, white women, the second wave was far more concerned with issues of class and race. The second wave was also dominated by a more radical tone that addressed taboo issues of sexuality and reproductive rights. In the 1950s, it was extraordinarily common for women to be fired from their jobs if they became pregnant. They could not open lines of credit without their husband's permission, and there were little government protections against sexual harassment and domestic violence. Job segregation was also incredibly common. Sure, women had greater access to jobs compared to the status of women during the first wave, but they were low-skilled, low-paying jobs. Jobs that promised more money and upward mobility would often announce women need not apply. In fact, it was entirely common during this time for newspaper classified ads to have separate sections for male job seekers and women job seekers. Second wave feminism was also deeply divided between liberal feminists and social justice feminists. Liberal feminists wanted to eliminate legal and social barriers that divided the sexes, like putting an end to those gendered help ads, in efforts to achieve true gender equality. Social justice feminists, on the other hand, believed that women as a sex were disadvantaged and required greater equality or differential treatment. So this is when you start getting into some pretty serious debates where social justice feminists would advocate for things like maternity leave, but make no mention of paternity leave, and the movement begins to take on this more exclusionary tone in the second wave, and men start beginning to feel more alienated from the movement. The second wave also gave way to the radical feminists whose primary ammunition was political theater. And this is where you get all of the classic stereotypes about feminism, from the bra burning in the freedom trash can, the crowning of sheep as Miss America, and this environment in which many of these radical feminists advocated ideas that were quite unpopular with the rest of society, particularly that childbearing was a form of patriarchal oppression. But despite the splintering of groups in the second wave era of feminism, significant achievements were made for women. The Supreme Court case, Pittsburgh Press versus the Pittsburgh Commission on Human Relations, struck down those sex-segregated job ads. Congress passed the Title IX Act, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in educational programs, and also the passage of the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, which barred employers for firing female employees on the basis of sex or pregnancy. While second-wave feminism often equated makeup, shaving, high heels, and revealing clothing as tools of patriarchal oppression, third-wave feminism, which occurred in the late 1990s, turned many of these feminist ideas completely upside down. Women of the third wave stepped into the stage as strong, empowered women, eschewing victimization and defining feminine beauty for themselves as subjects, not as objects. Unlike earlier waves of feminism, third wave feminism is less characterized by a specific political agenda and more of a cultural revolution. Third wavers are perhaps known best for appropriating derogatory terms like slut and bitch in order to subvert sexist culture and deprive it of verbal weaponry. Most third wavers also refuse to identify as a feminist or reject the label completely, arguing that this term itself entrenches the movement in gender exclusion. This definition and subsequent resignation of feminism has also been highly popularized by the media and American celebrities. When Lady Gaga was asked whether she was a feminist, she responded, "No, I love men." Shailene Woodley distanced herself from the term because she believes in, quote, sisterhood more than feminism. And Taylor Swift claims she's not a feminist because she doesn't, quote, think about things as guys versus girls. So again, kind of thinking about the material that was presented at the beginning of the first part of the lecture, Most Americans do in fact support the idea of gender equality, which is fundamentally the core principle of feminism. But over the years, more radical feminist groups have pushed a narrative that explicitly calls for differential treatment and women-only spaces, which not only created an environment that alienated male allies, but also created a strong disconnect between what it means to be an advocate for women's issues. For many, the word feminism is often associated with man-hating, superiority, polarizing, and exclusionary. And it's this final term that brings us to the fourth wave of feminism, which many scholars argue we are currently in the midst of. Unlike the third wave, which seemed to mostly focus on cultural revolution, fourth wave feminism is all about breaking down boundaries and dismantling oppressive power structures. The fourth wave is unique as it primarily uses the internet to call out misogyny in politics and culture. The Me Too campaign is a prime example of technological mobilization in support of feminist issues like sexual harassment and violence against women. This method of calling out socially unacceptable behavior via the internet has recently been characterized as part of a broader cancel culture. On one hand, you have some that argue it's long overdue, that people speak the truth, call attention to oppressive public figures, and demand social accountability by essentially public shaming individuals. Conversely, you also have a lot of people who believe cancel culture has gone too far, that it's detrimental to society, and that it does more harm to individual lives rather than promoting a good for all. Now, I've included a 20-minute documentary in this module about cancel culture, and I strongly encourage you watch it. I think that this is a really fascinating phenomena in our current political history, and I think it does a really good job at highlighting the pros and cons of cancel culture, and these are themes that we're going to continue to address throughout the semester, so I think you'll enjoy it, and I encourage you to go watch it. Lastly, gender identity and sexual positivity are strongly embraced in the fourth wave, and it is exceedingly inclusive of queer and trans identities. However, this inclusiveness was not well received by everyone. One of the largest splinters you see in fourth wave feminism is between gender-critical feminists and transgender women. Gender-critical feminists, sometimes labeled as trans-exclusionary radical feminists or TERFs, essentially believe that men are men and women are women, and there is no gray area between the two. They don't see gender as an identity, but more of a caste or social hierarchy, and they reject the idea that trans women face the same obstacles as cisgender women. Michelle Goldberg summarizes the major cleavages in the debate. According to the gender-critical viewpoint, anyone born a man retains male privilege in society. Even if he chooses to live as a woman and accept a correspondingly subordinate social position, the fact that he has a choice means that he can never understand what being a woman is really like. By extension, when trans women demand to be accepted as women, they are simply exercising another form of male entitlement. All of this enrages trans women and their allies who point to the discrimination that trans people endure. Although radical feminism is far from achieving all its goals, women have won far more formal equality than trans people have. In most states, it's legal to fire someone for being transgender, and transgender people can't serve in the military. Does this sound familiar to you? A recent survey by the National Center of Transgender Equality and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force found overwhelming levels of anti-trans violence and persecution. 41% of respondents said that they had attempted suicide. So as you can see, each of the four waves of feminism has been witness to some form of exclusionary thought or behavior. First wave feminists cozied up to segregationists in the South to push the 19th Amendment to victory. Second wave feminists began advocating for women-only spaces, which began alienating male allies. Third wave feminism was extremely provocative with its slut walks and topless protests, which resulted in more conservative feminists distancing themselves from the movement. And fourth wave feminism has tested the boundaries of the movement's willingness to be inclusive of other members, and opening a dialogue on whether to be a woman is a purely biological factor, or whether the topic of gender identity itself deserves a seat at the table when discussing political, social, and economic inequities in society today. I truly hope you enjoyed this week's lecture and learning more about the history of feminism in the United States. Here are some of the big questions I'd like you to consider moving forward. After learning more about feminism this week, has it changed your opinion on how you associate or identify with feminism? Is there a particular brand of feminism you agree most with, least with? Do you think feminists should use cancel culture tactics to call out discrimination and violence against women? Are these tactics effective? How important is it to you that modern feminists be more inclusive? Do you think feminism would be more successful if it promoted membership from all members of society, regardless of biological sex or gender identity? That's it for this week's lecture. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, thank you for watching.